Good morning and welcome to the 5th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2021. Apologies have been received from committee member Andy Whiteman. The first item on the agenda is a decision by the committee to take items 6 and 7 in private. Are we agreed? It appears that we are agreed on that, and therefore we will now come to item 2 on the agenda, and this is the climate change plan. And with us we have the following. First of all, Paul Wheelhouse, Minister for Energy, Connectivity and the Islands. Ragni Lowe, who is the team leader in heat policy. Neil Rafferty, Head of Electricity Policy and Large-Scale Renewables. Sasha Maguire, who's a Senior Economic Advisor. Scott Bradley, Head of Oil and Gas and Industrial Decarbonisation Unit. And David Mallon, who is the Head of the unit at the Climate Change Division. So I will start this part of the agenda by asking the Minister to make a brief opening statement. So, Minister.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, colleagues, as well. I welcome this opportunity to discuss the energy sector content of the Climate Change Plan update. And while the targets in the plan are undoubtedly challenging, it's worth remembering that policies it contains sets us on the right pathway towards achieving them. The CCPU will help ensure that our transition to net zero is geared to being a just one that creates jobs and enables green economic recovery from COVID-19. However, while we can achieve much through devolved policies, progress towards our ambitious net zero targets will be at risk without the right policy and regulatory action on the part of the UK Government in some key areas. And that's why we've committed to continue to push the UK Government on the many barriers currently preventing Scotland from reaching our full potential. We have a positive working relationship at ministerial and official level, but there are some areas where we have been having to force the pace. Now, taking each CCPU chapter in turn, firstly, electricity generation, where we have made excellent progress. In 2019, Scotland's renewable electricity output was equivalent to 90% of our gross electricity consumption. However, the growth we've seen in recent years, with the exception of the first half of 2020 when COVID-19 disrupted projects, we will need to continue and accelerate growth if electricity is to play its full part in decarbonising our energy-intensive industries, heat in buildings and, of course, transport. Because all legislation and regulation of electricity markets is a reserved policy area, that means we really need the UK Government to play its part and to deliver the required radical policies and changes to regulation. And these areas include issues like support for new pumped storage hydro capacity, with some key projects already consented and waiting for a route to market, approaches to network charging and investment, and the right market incentives for renewable and zero carbon electricity. Convener, heat accounts for more than half the energy Scotland consumes. On heat in buildings and energy efficiency, as outlined in the CCPU, our vision is for transformation of more than 1 million homes and an estimated 50,000 non-domestic buildings to be using low and zero emissions heating systems by 2030. And that level of investment is without precedent in modern times, but it presents a great green recovery opportunity as well, clearly. A recently published draft heat and building strategy provides more detail on the near-term actions the Scottish Government is taking to deliver on the pathway to achieving this target, and our estimates are that we will require whole economy investment, certainly in the region of around 17 billion over the next decade. And these actions and investments will support thousands of green jobs across the energy efficiency and heat sector and the wider supply chain, reflecting our ambition for a just transition to net zero. I'd like to finish by discussing the role of industry achieving our net zero ambitions, and this is an often overlooked issue, but I'm pleased to see the committee's taken some time to look at this. To meet the pathway set out in the CCPU, by 2032, industry's emissions need to decrease by over 40% on 2018 levels, whilst keeping Scottish industry globally competitive and, of course, sustainable. We know that negative emitting technologies, or NETs, such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which I refer to as BECCS, and direct air capture with carbon storage, or DACs, will be vital. And the plan update sets our ambitions to research, develop NETs, while clearly recognising the major challenges and need for constant review. We know for sure that there remains a significant risk that decarbonising faster than the rest of the UK and indeed Europe could lead to carbon leakage, and both support for investment and a level regulatory playing field are required. And that's why a strategic whole system approach to decarbonising industry offers a chance to position Scottish business to expand into global markets and deliver long-term carbon growth. So in conclusion, thank you very much for allowing me to make some opening remarks, Convener. Greatly appreciate that, and I'm happy to take questions from the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that. The goal is net zero, and can you tell us, has the Scottish Government made a detailed assessment of renewable capacity, set a clear pathway as the Committee on Climate Change has said will be necessary with a clear trajectory to 2045?
It's a very good point, Convener. I mean, I quite often refer to this myself and saying we effectively have to double the amount of electricity, renewable electricity that we can generate in Scotland to achieve our wider decarbonisation goals. There will always be, of course, some uncertainty about precisely how much renewable electricity we might require in that context and from which technologies we will require it. And much will depend on the different choices we take around decarbonisation for heat and transport, and of course industrial decarbonisation as well, and the degree to which there's technological innovation. But our strong expectation is that Scotland will need a large and accelerated growth in our renewable electricity capacity, and that's true for the UK as a whole, of course. But our initial assessment, as set out in the Climate Change Plan update, was that we would require between 11 and 16 gigawatts by 2032. We currently have just under 12 gigawatts of renewable electricity capacity at the moment, and we'll be carrying out more detailed analysis over the coming year and beyond as we intend to refresh Scotland's energy strategy later this year, subject to being re-elected, and develop an electricity generation policy statement as well. That will obviously try and look at the range of sources as well, Convener, but certainly the quantum is, at this moment in time, we estimate between 11 and 16 gigawatts of new capacity in the lifetime of this net zero strategy.
And what about things that can stand in the way of achieving these goals? I mean, some people would say that the planning procedures are too cumbersome or slow things down. Others would be concerned that the consenting process, if it's too quick, would mean undesirable development, which can have negative environmental impacts in different ways. So what exactly is the government doing to assess these practical issues?
Well, it's a fair comment, Convener. Certainly we know that consenting process has a key role to play in enabling the delivery of new capacity, and whether it's the onshore or offshore, indeed the overhead or undergrounded electricity transmission cables as well, and distribution networks. These are all vital parts of the system that we're trying to create, and there has been steady progress in the improvement in the speed of consideration of consenting decisions. I think over 50 weeks some years ago, down to near 20, 29, 26 weeks. Now I'll try and dig out the figures for you and come back to the committee with the detail of that. But it's certainly an important part of the process, and you're absolutely right to ensure that we get the rigour right. So we obviously are doing everything we can to try and improve the speed of the process, and we need the help of the developers in that context as well, because there are many steps that they're required to take that can have a negative impact on the pace at which these decisions are taken. So there's a balance to be struck there. We obviously need the developer to play their part, but working together, as we have been able to do in the past, to meet auction round deadlines for Contract for Difference, for example. We've worked back from those deadlines with developers to let them know when we would need key pieces of information in place to enable them to have their consent, if we're able to give a consent in time for participating in the auction round. So there are things we can do there. You're right, though, we have to do it in a way that we do not throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of the rigour of the process, ensuring communities have their right to be engaged. There's obviously key steps in the process, such as potentially if there's a statutory consultee like a local authority that maintains an objection, then that requires a public inquiry, local inquiry, which can add significant time to the process. But those are things that are mandatory. We can't circumvent those, we have to allow that time to be taken. But we are working very hard within the Energy Consents Unit and within Marine Scotland to do all we can to try and work with the industry to speed up where we can do. There are other barriers, though, that have a key bearing, and I will look to you, convener, to see if these are issues you want to pick up later. But certainly around the transmission and distribution networks, there are procedures through the regulator Ofgem, which obviously govern the needs case for things like interconnectors to our islands to unlock the potential of our island routes. We've seen progress with Shetland, but still waiting for decisions, positive decisions for Western Isles and Orkney. And increasingly, we are concerned not so much about the policy position of Ofgem, but the capacity to deal with what is likely to be a very large quantum of decisions they will have to take on investment in grids around the UK and certainly in Scotland as we seek to connect in offshore wind sites that we wish to develop with. We have a target, as you may know, for 11 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and that will require significant investment in grid to enable those projects to connect to the grid, transmit their power to the GB network. So there are a number of barriers, different barriers that are in place. Some of them physical, such as grid, others around route to market, which affect the likes of pumped hydro storage, marine energy, and until recently, the lack of access to the CFD auction process for onshore wind was also presenting a challenge to that particular sector. But I'm pleased to see the UK government have opened up Pot 1 for onshore wind projects again. I'll take your guidance, convener. I could obviously talk for quite a while on barriers that we face.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, indeed. Perhaps if we all try to keep our questions focused and to the point, and also, Minister, if you're able to try to do the same.
Okay.
We'll now come to questions from Alex Rowley. I think we have Alex now, do we?
Do, convener. Morning, Minister.
Morning.
In terms of just sticking with this planning, because the committee has heard from some who say that the planning process is fairly cumbersome and takes a long time, and they feel that if we are going to hit the targets, then something needs to be done there. And I want to specifically come back to that. But firstly, I noticed that in terms of, and they're both linked, community and local ownership, the government, I think, did not hit the target that it was aiming at for 2020. And my question is, do you believe there is a link? Because my experience is that there are many community organisations who would like, having seen some of the success where you have community ownership and on land, and they find it difficult. They find that developers don't want to necessarily engage with them, and they find it difficult to access resources. Has the government looked at that, and is community ownership a key part of its strategy?
Well, certainly, to Mr. Rowley, thank you for the question. It's a really important one. In terms of the latter point that you make, absolutely, our aspirations are to increase the share of projects which have a community or local ownership component, or entirely community owned or locally owned, and indeed to try and see more shared revenue options in terms of planning determinations that go through. We've got an aspiration to try and have around half of all planning decisions involve some degree of shared revenue model or community or local ownership. So that is very important, not only because it helps to regenerate communities in many cases and to give empowerment to local communities who've got their own revenue stream that gives them freedom to do what they wish at a local level. We see some great examples in the Western Isles and other parts of Scotland where communities like Storrs Uist in the South Uist area that Mr. Rowley may be aware of have a project there which is going to unlock about 20 million plus pounds of net revenue for that community to allow them to invest in local business facilities, upgraded harbour facilities, and access roads, social housing. And Berkshire Housing Association in my own area is invested through 3 turbines, the Fisherman 3 as they're known, and generate again more than 20 million through its feed-in tariff contract to invest in what is believed to be up to 500 affordable homes in the Berkshire area of the Scottish borders. It's about a third of the border's social housing requirement. These are really great opportunities. Obviously, when it comes to communities that are sometimes faced with several applications in their area, that can be quite daunting, and engaging with developers can be quite challenging. And we do give support to communities in those circumstances through CARES, the CARES Fund, which is administered by Local Energy Scotland on our behalf. And that can provide professional support to local communities to help them in negotiation with developers. Obviously, it can be quite challenging to reach out to developers around community benefit decisions that may be taken at a local level by the developer, and to help them engage with that. And it can be quite daunting for volunteers in that context to take on what can often be quite large companies in those kind of discussions. So we are very aware of that need to help communities cope with that, and hence CARES has successfully supported communities in and around Cumnock, for example, where there was a number of projects that they were facing simultaneously, and to help. Not all projects will necessarily go through planning, I should stress, because we obviously would have to allow those decisions on a case-by-case basis. So it doesn't presume all will go through, but it does allow them to engage with the developers, have a little bit of professional support. And obviously through CARES we can also help the community develop its own community energy project, and then provide support to them to obtain commercial finance to fund the project. So I'm happy to give more details to the committee if that would be of interest to the committee about the support we've got in place for communities.
Thank you. I mean, I do think it's an important area. Community ownership in terms of renewables also creates community buy-in, and my experience is that there are barriers, so perhaps it's something, Minister, that I could get some information on. But specifically then the link to that and planning, and I'm making that link because I think if you have community buy-in, then the developments will move much faster. But the delayed NPF, the National Planning Framework 4, will that impact on the ability to tackle climate change, achieving net zero emissions? And will it make achieving net zero emissions a material consideration in the planning process? What would that be?
Well, it's important to identify NPF4. Mr. Rowley is correct, because it's going to be a key policy document that will be used in planning extensively. Our NPF4 position statement is explicit about the shift needed to achieve net zero and quote unquote significant choices that must be made. It highlights the need to support renewable developments, including repowering of existing sites where new technology allows sites to have more efficient technology, and extending existing developments, as well as new and upgraded grid capacity and carbon capture and storage as well, which is a good opportunity for just transition for Scotland too. So we are continuing to engage closely with stakeholders ahead of the fuller consultation following the election in the autumn of this year, with the intention of the policy statement position statement was put out to try and set out the key principles that would be applied in the NPF4, and so that's one that we have definitely set out, that we believe that a shift is needed to achieve net zero, and that's going to be reflected in the NPF4, subject to the consultation, of course.
Okay, thank you. And just lastly, could I ask what work is the Scottish Government undertaking to ensure that the offshore grid connections are coordinated and that they're not just point to point? Again,
that's extremely important for two reasons. One, obviously, the more complex the grids that's required for connecting up offshore wind sites, the more challenges there are then with other marine users, such as the fishing community, around static gear and the kind of interactions with their fishing grounds. We're very mindful of that. Had good engagement with the Scottish Fishermen's Federation through Mr. Ewing, Mary Goujon previously, now Mr. McPherson and myself. And we are also aware on cost grounds. It obviously makes a huge difference to the viability of projects if reductions can be made in terms of the cost of the transmission infrastructure that's required to take the power from the offshore site to shore. And obviously, if we can use that more efficiently, we'll be able to save significant funding and make it more cost effective to develop new offshore wind sites. And in the years to come, as we look to develop our ability to produce green hydrogen offshore, that also will be very helpful to the likes of the oil and gas sector and other inputs to try and develop, bless you, convener, develop the infrastructure required. So we know that the current approach does need to be reformed, and we have had some positive discussions with Kwasi Kwarteng before he was promoted to Secretary of State, and I'm sure he'll maintain his interest in that. We'll look to engage with Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who's the new Energy Minister at UK level to work with her on trying to, the work was initially started at UK level, but now the Scottish Government is an important contributor to these discussions. And we'll obviously try and engage with our own Scottish stakeholders about what we can do on that to ensure that as good coordination as possible is made. I drove past on the way this morning the infrastructure work's being done at Torness Power Station to connect in the Narth-na-Gaoithe offshore wind site just off the coast of Fife. And that, that's a sign, I suppose, of that investment already taking place. And we need to ensure that these connections are timely, because there is a risk if we don't get that investment that the projects that are currently going through ScotWind might be delayed because of lack of access to grids in the early 2030s. And that's obviously a concern we have to try and address. And we need to try and engage with the communities locally to try and, as you say, get their buy-in to the importance of this, do what we can to mitigate any concerns they have. And we think there's a very strong case to have much of the grid development and optioneering take place in parallel with the leasing process rather than subsequently, because that can sometimes seem to be a bit of an afterthought. And it's one of the key issues we're going to be looking at in more detail.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Morning, Minister.
Morning.
You know, you've just spoken about the need for grid connections and for renewables to have access, but obviously another aspect is actually grid charging. And SSE told us that Ofgem uses a complicated methodology which is heavily skewed towards southern projects and away from Scottish projects for which the cost in energy terms has a premium of about £3 per megawatt hour. So my question is, you mentioned in your opening remarks that the UK government has to change some policy and regulations. So could you maybe say what needs to change in order that we continue the investment in renewable generation?
Well, it's a hugely important point that you raised, Mr. MacDonald, because it's been a subject that's been discussed regularly within the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, the Energy Networks Strategic Leadership Group and the Scottish Energy Advisory Board, is both the need for decisions around grid investment, but also the fairness of the charging regime, because there is a premium, unfortunately, charged to developers as they connect, particularly into the north of Scotland, which is one of the most expensive parts of the network to connect into. This is, of course, a reserved area, and we do respect that, but when we have been pressing for many years for a fairer system, which works with rather than against Scotland's huge renewables potential. It's obviously in the interest of UK government as well, and we believe GB customers to have, for example, wind energy in the most efficient locations for production of wind energy. And clearly we have, as we all know, to our cost. Scotland is a wonderful country, but we have a very strong wind regime. It can be both a positive thing in terms of generating energy and a negative thing in terms of the weather we face as individuals. But we do have a good wind regime. It's strong average wind speeds, and that means we have some of the most efficient wind energy sites anywhere in the world are in Scotland. And we have been pressing for many years to reflect that in the transmission charging regime. You mentioned SSE, Mr. MacDonald, and we know there's new analysis that's been published this week by SSEN and Scottish Renewables, which support our concern that transmission charges in the north of Scotland are higher than the rest of GB and remain volatile and unpredictable, which obviously doesn't help developers in securing finance to have that unpredictability. And the consequences of this are perhaps a disincentive to invest in renewable generation at a time when such an investment will, obviously, if we talked around the net zero mission we have and climate emergency, the need could not be greater at this moment in time to seek that investment. And it will absolutely be vital, not just for us, but in Scotland, but also for the UK government. And there are clear concerns that the investment risks that are inherent in such a system could result in higher costs for consumers as well, rather than deliver benefits. So we appear to have a charging system which acts against the renewables development the government wants to see much more of. And that's true of the UK government as well. They want to see more of this too. If we are to develop hydrogen, for example, in Scotland and take advantage of the opportunities to generate green hydrogen, which I know there's strong support for across the Parliament, then potentially we need to have a look at a system that, as I understand it, regardless of how much of the power that a site uses to produce green hydrogen, it will be charged full whack for connecting to the grid. So it may well be that most of the power for a site theoretically could be used to generate green hydrogen, but they will charge the full transmission charge as if 100% of the power was going through the transmission network. So that's clearly something that doesn't really stack up in my mind as being fair, and we need to see that kind of a more dynamic and perhaps more nuanced system put in place. And we have had discussion with Ofgem, Jonathan Bailey, Ofgem, and we've got Francis Warburton from Ofgem on our Energy Networks Strategic Leadership Group, which is obviously very helpful to have us have that dialogue with the regulator. And we do believe that's a key step that UK Government can help with in giving direction to Ofgem to address this perceived unfairness and actual unfairness. And it would be loath of me to use specific developers' figures, but there are developers we know in the last auction round who felt that transmission charging alone was sufficient to knock them out of the auction. So we also think there's a risk that the transmission charging regime, TNUoS charges, are distorting the market for offshore wind, and that's clearly not something that I would imagine UK ministers would be happy with either.
The Scottish Government has also called on Ofgem's function to change so as a statutory objective to support the delivery of net zero. So, what would you like to see in relation to governance? What changes would you like to see to help deliver that net zero?
Well, you're absolutely right, Mr. McDonald. We've called upon UK ministers to formally change the remit of Ofgem, and that's for a very practical reason. In the recent discussion we've had around the RIIO-2 determination by Ofgem around the transmission infrastructure investment needs of the GB network going forward, it's obvious that Ofgem are fulfilling their statutory remit. They're looking very closely at the impact of costs on consumers. But we think there's although we know that Ofgem themselves are very sympathetic to the points we're making around the need to target net zero, there were some potentially decisions that could have taken place in the July draft determination that would have had a very significant impact on delaying government investment and government achievement of targets in areas such as transport and heat decarbonisation through the impact on specific projects. For example, I know that at least one of the distribution network operators was concerned about the impact on rail electrification of a decision that Ofgem had effectively in draft terms put in place that would have prevented them investing in a timely way to facilitate Mr Matheson's objectives around rail decarbonisation. So there were some very practical things there, and that was largely based on, I suppose, perhaps a slightly risk-averse approach that Ofgem has to take in terms of protecting consumers against short-term increases in cost. We would argue that potentially by doing that, you end up locking in higher costs down the line for consumers by not allowing the investment to happen in a timely way. And we certainly tried to encourage Ofgem to take a view on having battery investment, to allow investment to take place in grid ahead of the investment in the wind generation and other renewable generation sites. So that's a key area. We've certainly had some encouragement. I'm really pleased to see UK Government appears to be listening to that kind of logic in terms of the UK Energy White Paper, which acknowledged the governance of the system needs to change and to shift away from a model that perhaps reflects what would fairly have been the situation maybe 30 years ago, rather than what it needs to reflect now to target net zero goals and targets that we have in place for 2045 and 2050, respectively, for Scotland and the UK. So we just need to see that recognised and also to support local energy markets and systems, which again is a new feature of decarbonisation, and to also to ensure that these bodies they're obviously best placed to oversee these systems and make sure they're geared up to do that in the context of a climate emergency. So we're obviously keen to see further detail on what the UK Government will propose there, but we're very supportive of that direction of travel, and we'll continue to press that Scottish interests and ambitions are fully taken into account. And that's no criticism of the personnel at Ofgem, I should stress. They are doing what they are set up to do in statutory terms. We just want their statutory terms to change to formally reflect the need to tackle the climate emergency.
And my final point, SSE has proposed a net zero delivery plan to monitor progress and update each year. What improvements can be made to the annual energy statement and climate change delivery plans to clearly show progress in the relevant sectors?
Well, we certainly recognise these calls. We obviously need, I suppose there's an old saying, isn't it, what measures gets done, what gets measured gets done. And I think the annual energy statement is important for us to be able to monitor progress on our own targets, particularly in areas where we've had challenges like heat. We need to obviously up our game there as a society, and our targets need to be chased hard, and we're intending to do that. But if we, the part of this is obviously uncertain because we've got the Scottish Parliament elections to come, and I don't want to be taking anything for granted there. But if we are re-elected, we would intend to refresh the energy strategy later this year, take on board the climate change plan update, the new pathways in areas such as industrial decarbonisation, take account of policy developments in areas like hydrogen, make sure we're up to date on those. And obviously there's been changing market conditions in the renewable sector, and huge progress in areas like solar, for example, much cheaper than it used to be. So we need to do appropriate consultation with stakeholders, with the Scottish Energy Advisory Board and all the strategic leadership groups and other ministerial groups that sit under that, to make sure we're taking as much advice from the professionals and stakeholders as we can, and then we look to develop a clear route map for the energy sector's transition to net zero. And of course, if changes are needed to the annual energy statement itself to provide a monitoring tool for that, then we will clearly do that to reflect the shape of the energy strategy as it then sits. But we certainly look for any guidance from the committee as to areas that you feel members would welcome being considered as part of the annual energy statement to add to what we've already got.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Minister.
Morning.
I'd like to ask about what work has the Scottish Government undertaken to quantify and mitigate emissions from products that are consumed domestically, rather than just the production?
Yeah, it's a really important area. I mean, as I'm sure the committee are aware, we monitor our carbon footprint as well as our production emissions in Scotland. So most of the focus is naturally, I guess, on Scotland's production emissions, the greenhouse gas emission targets we tend to refer to, i.e. the net zero target for 2045. But clearly, we also need to try and look to monitor our footprint more internationally as well, because we obviously are consuming many products from around the world. And our research study that's been underway to identify policy opportunities for the Scottish Government to influence domestic demand, obviously on the part of consumers, businesses, and indeed public sector, for a range of manufactured goods that can demonstrate lower carbon intensity than their competitor products. And it's one of the frustrations I've had as well, that quite often we're seeing imported products coming into Scotland, supplanting those that have been manufactured in Scotland, but the buyer is not taking into account perhaps in some cases, the hideously higher CO2 emissions in producing those goods abroad than our domestic producers can produce at home. And we need to find a way of incentivising investment to decarbonise Scotland's existing energy-intensive industries and manufacturing industries, prevent carbon leakage so they don't effectively lose their competitive edge compared with others elsewhere, but also support the development of new low-carbon products and industries. And there was a net zero report in 2019 from the Committee on Climate Change, which emphasised the need for the government to implement an approach to incentivise domestic industries to reduce their emissions in ways that do not adversely affect their competitiveness. And by driving, we understand that by driving end user demand for lower carbon products, Scottish public procurement and consumer decisions can help to create a level playing field for industries that invest in decarbonising the process, to effectively reward them for doing what we need them to do to help improve the climate mitigation performance of the Scottish economy, and helping to safeguard manufacturing jobs and skills in Scotland as a consequence of that interaction. So it's not an easy thing to do, but we're very mindful we need to do it. And I think looking at public procurement as well as behavioural change of individuals and businesses to make them more conscious of where they're procuring their products from, and looking actively, whether it's through labelling or other means, to try and help them buy products that are not only in their manufacturing but also their operation lower carbon than perhaps the ones they bought previously. It can be a way to help businesses in Scotland, the rest of the UK and Europe indeed, that are probably more progressive in that respect to win the work in comparison with other markets where those issues aren't taken so seriously.
Minister, consumers tend to purchase goods based as much on price as anything else. And if, as is implied here, costs are being simply passed on to consumers, what are the implications for a just transition?
Well, it's a hugely stinging issue because we obviously are very mindful of our very strong push towards decarbonisation, but not everybody can afford that, and so therefore, we have to try and put in place mechanisms that help support whether it's businesses to take on the task of investing and retooling for lower carbon production methods, or for consumers. And so there are some targeted measures through, perhaps a really good example is in relation to domestic heating, where we have the area-based schemes that can, for those who are facing the most severe fuel poverty, provide grant funding rather than loan funding, grant funding of up to £12,000 per premises to help people decarbonise their heating systems. And that's our reflection of the fact that these are people that are really challenged financially. They might want to do the right thing, but they cannot afford to do the right thing. And we need to try and help those individuals. We're also put in place a range of measures such as cashback payments for perhaps households with a higher income who can afford to invest in loan finance through Scottish Government, through Home Energy Scotland as a route into that. We can provide them cashbacks of up to 75% the amount they're borrowing to try and incentivise investment on their part. So it's a really important area. We can perhaps provide more information to the committee if you'd be interested on the range of different schemes that we have in place to help different target audiences. But you're right, behavioural change is a huge part of trying to achieve our climate change plan update targets, and we need to try and engage consumers, whether they are businesses or individuals, to try and help us with this task. But not everybody can afford to do so, so hence incentivisation on the part of those who can afford to do so is one target, but also financial support. Those who can't is another area of support.
Timescales really are exceptionally tight for decarbonising the industrial sector. Given the Chemical Industries Association and Mineral Products Association have raised concerns about ongoing operating costs and a lack of business case for decarbonisation, is it realistic to expect emissions to reduce by 43% by 2032?
It's a huge challenge. We certainly understand that. You're absolutely right, Mr. Beattie. We recently published research on deep decarbonisation pathways for Scottish industries, which did find them more positively to be technically feasible to reduce industrial emissions in Scotland by more than 80% compared to 2018 levels by 2045. But that would require additional efforts to tackle residual emissions, potentially through negative emission technologies, or NETs, as I referred to earlier, as well as action taken in other sectors to be consistent with a net zero pathway. The Committee on Climate Change, as you may know, also say in their 6th carbon budget that industry in Scotland could effectively be zero carbon by 2045. So they believe we can go beyond that 80% reduction. However, it's clear that we need to go further. We need to go faster for sure. And if we're going to meet the interim targets by 2032, and policy intervention is required to address those key challenges. So I'd agree with comments from stakeholders about ongoing operating costs and a lack of business case for decarbonisation. But as a starting point, our 2020-21 programme for government committed us to an additional £60 million for industrial manufacturing across Scotland to overcome challenges that the sector faces in transitioning towards a low carbon economy. And there were 2 specific funds within that 60 million that draw your attention to. 34 million Scottish Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, supporting deployment of industrial energy efficiency technologies and feasibility studies on subsector deep decarbonisation. That's in parallel with the UK Government's Scottish Industrial Energy Transformation Fund itself. We carved out, I got an agreement with the UK Minister to carve out funding for Scotland so we could create our own fund, and then that gives us the freedom to operate maybe at a faster pace should we need to than to achieve our earlier targets than in the UK. And we also set up a £26 million manufacturing low carbon challenge fund, which will support innovation in low carbon technology, processes and infrastructure. And we do have to obviously reflect there's a mix of balance, if you like, of reserved and devolved powers and responsibilities. And there remains a significant risk that decarbonising faster than the rest of the UK and indeed Europe could lead to carbon leakage So we do need to work closely with the UK government on this. We need to support investment on a level regulatory playing field for Scottish businesses, and we're trying to ensure that the industrial sector understands its role in decarbonisation, the opportunities that this can bring for them, and the support that is offered to manage that transition. So it will not be easy, but we are engaging very closely with the industry to look at how best we can use the SIETF funding and the manufacturing fund as well to best effect.
But given the concerns that have been raised, what are the implications if the sector is slow to decarbonise?
Well, if that was to happen, then there's obviously a risk that, for example, if energy-intensive industries were slow to decarbonise because the uptake of fuel switching technologies was delayed by slower development timelines or infrastructure, lack of availability of infrastructure, or the lack of economic incentives. In some cases, that might be needed to be provided by UK government. The number of sites finding themselves locked in with fossil fuel technologies until after 2045 could become significant. So it will make it very challenging to meet Scotland's net zero target if that was to happen. So obviously the Scottish Industrial Energy Transformation Fund and the MLCCF are being provided to help us try and get the ball rolling there, and to encourage through the climate change plan update the prompt development of the required technologies and deployment of the enabling infrastructure to avoid that kind of lock-in outcome. And in addition, you may be aware, we launched recently the £180 million Emerging Energy Technologies Fund, which would support development of Scottish hydrogen, about 100 million allocated for the purpose of hydrogen, and 80 million for other technologies, including carbon capture and storage industries. And this is all to be spent over the next 5 years. So we're trying to pump prime the investment by business and trying to work with individual businesses and through Nexus as well, which is a cluster for carbon capture in Scotland, to try and ensure that the money is, as I say, targeted in the most effective way to bring forward projects where we can do so.
My last question is, does the Scottish Government support the CCC's proposal for there to be carbon border tariffs and minimum carbon standards to enable decarbonisation whilst ensuring that jobs are not offshored?
Well, it's an important point. We've got a new kind of framework in place now with the devolved governments and UK government to discuss matters relating to net zero through a ministerial group that has met just recently. We've obviously implemented as a parliament the UK emissions trading scheme with the UK government and other devolved administrations. So we've implemented the statutory instruments to allow that to happen before Brexit took place. And that the aim of that, I understand, is to mirror the EU ETS and to provide a level playing field as recommended by the Committee on Climate Change in its sixth carbon budget advice. So in particular, UK ETS would include protections for sectors at high risk of carbon leakage, would help to try and maintain their competitiveness with companies against companies out with the UK that don't face equivalent carbon costs. And we obviously support linking the UK ETS to other carbon markets internationally as well, to provide a more effective kind of global carbon market, and the move towards an international level playing field through negotiations that have taken place under the Paris Agreement Article 6. So we will work with the UK government on the future evolution of UK ETS. That's going to be a standing item on the ministerial group I referenced, including reforms to ensure that there is genuinely an international level playing field and our businesses aren't disadvantaged. But we can also help avoid that carbon leakage through the kind of funding interventions I mentioned in my answer to your previous question. So it's a mixture of getting the carbon pricing correct, but also giving the right support to business to invest early in new technology as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Minister, I don't wish to dampen your enthusiasm, but we are, of course, limited for time here, and you are welcome, of course, to spend further detail in writing on any of the matters raised for the committee's benefit. Graham Simpson.
Well, thanks, Convener, and with those words ringing in my ears, I will just ask one question. Minister, it's good to see you. Now, just following on from Colin Beattie's questions, in written evidence on the CCPU to this committee, Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage had significant concerns that the infrastructure investment plan might not be, in their words, fit for purpose. And the main contention is that the plan doesn't consider industrial decarbonisation. We've just talked about that. And they say that the plan doesn't adequately consider the infrastructure needs relating to carbon capture, storage and hydrogen, and risks hampering their deployment. And they say that they urge the Scottish Parliament, not Scottish Government in their words, to ensure that infrastructure investment in Scotland aligns fully with Scotland's climate change targets. They say quite a bit more, but in the interest of time I won't go into that. I just wonder what your response would be to those comments.
Well, we obviously, and thank you for your opening remarks, Mr. Simpson. I mean, I'm glad to be here, and I will hear the ringing in my ears, the convener's words as well. I think what we can do, we obviously supply some more detail on this, but clearly I recognise the challenge that to achieve what is a really exciting opportunity for Scotland in terms of carbon capture and storage, and like Professor Hazeldine and others, I know I've spoken to you very much on this issue. We need to get the infrastructure right, need to get the regulatory framework right, and obviously we are working closely as we can with UK Government on this, where we've got a common interest, a common goal here, to develop this technology. Acorn in Scotland at St Fergus is a hugely exciting opportunity for us. We are very optimistic that that could be up and running by 2024, as early as 2024, and if we're able to achieve an accelerated deployment timescale for that, that has the potential to store up to 10 megatons of CO2 annually, which is a huge contribution to decarbonising not only Scotland, but potentially the rest of the UK and also European neighbours indeed. So it's really important to get that right. I think obviously we're trying to encourage existing players in the oil and gas sector to invest in this. It seems to be an area where the industry is really embracing the opportunity, and they can see it's being important to them. It's a really important just transition opportunity, but I will certainly happily write to the committee convener to give Mr Simpson some more detail on what steps we are taking, but also where we are aware the UK Government is taking steps as well around the regulatory framework, because that might perhaps be best lend itself to being put in a letter because of the detail involved. But I certainly recognise the concern Mr Simpson's raised. We have to get this right. It's too big an opportunity to miss, and it can also do a heck of a lot of good in terms of helping us decarbonise the Scottish economy and indeed help others to do likewise.
Well, thank you, and that was nice and quick, and we can move on, convener.
Richard Lyle in that case.
Thank you, convener, and I also will be quick and group my questions together. Morning, Minister. Well, Scotland has a significant advantage in terms of engineering expertise and geological storage for carbon capture storage. So how can Scotland capture the economic and transition benefits? And whilst evidence has been broadly in agreement that new jobs can be created, what really is a green job? And what do you consider to be a green job? And how are we going to ensure that workers are reskilled?
Well, it's a hugely important point, this, because clearly we and I recognise in Mr Lyle's question that there's obviously a need to do more to kind of define what is a good green job, and I will come on to that. But when it comes to carbon capture, we do believe that Scotland has a potential comparative advantage. Not only, there's a huge important just transition opportunity for Scotland because we have a mature oil and gas industry, not just in terms of the skills base. We have hugely talented individuals in the industry, but we also have the assets, the reservoirs, depleted reservoirs, particularly thinking like Goldeneye reservoir is one that is thought to be the best candidate for this, but not the only candidate for storage of CO2. And that, it's a great opportunity to sustain economic growth in Scotland, and particularly to provide support to those parts of the Scottish economy and Scottish communities that are dependent on oil and gas jobs at the moment. So our Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan is a key document here, and that is seeking to support the reskilling and retraining of skilled workers so they can access new good quality jobs that become available. And clearly we have a talented oil and gas sector, a world-class supply chain that wins work around the world. We obviously aware of the challenges we've got in the offshore wind sector, but our oil and gas sector supply chain wins work around the world, shipping substantial capital goods from Scotland to other markets, and that provides us with a great foundation to harness the benefits of our energy transition. So we want to make sure that projects like Acorn are successful. We can reuse those legacy oil and gas pipeline infrastructure and assets to potentially safely and permanently store CO2. And as I made the points earlier on to Mr. Simpson about the timescales and the potential scale of impacts, I'll not repeat them. But the Centre for Energy Policy at Strathclyde University suggested that by 2030, anywhere between 7,000 and 45,000 UK jobs could ultimately be associated with Scotland securing just 40% of the carbon storage element of a European CO2 management market. And I think we've got reason to believe that is achievable. By 2050, this could rise to between 22,000 and 105,000 jobs. Now, I know there's a lot of scepticism about job numbers. These are not our numbers. These are ones that are being produced by economists. But it shows the potential prize that's there. The oil and gas sector in Scotland at the moment and its supply chain in total would amount to between 105 and 110,000 jobs. That gives you a sense of scale with the potential to provide a just transition for people working in industry, on top of hydrogen, offshore wind and other technologies that we could see generate good green jobs. So I do believe in terms of the definition, there's obviously an issue in terms of the Climate Energy Skills Action Plan looks at 3 categories of jobs. To answer Mr. Lyle's question about what makes a good green job. So there's new and emerging jobs that relate directly to the transition to net zero. That could be, for example, hydrogen cell technicians, carbon monitoring technicians, urban miners, jobs affected by a transition to net zero that will need enhanced skills or competencies, such as architects and environmental consultants, or existing jobs that will be needed in greater numbers as a result of the transition to net zero, such as installation installers, energy assessors, designers and multi-skilled on-site operatives. So there's obviously likes of plumbers, electricians, other skill sets I could refer to that will increasingly move into these areas. And also even within the oil and gas sector itself, we'd like to see considerable change in the role profiles of individuals that may be working almost entirely in oil and gas now, might be working part of their time or increasingly in areas such as offshore wind or electrification of offshore infrastructure to reduce its emissions. So I hope that helps. We could provide more detail if the committee would like it, but I think that gives a sense as to some of the kind of areas that we're looking at in terms of the different types of green jobs that we're referring to.
I actually think that's an excellent insight into what is a green job. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Mr. Lyle.
Thank you. And now Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Convener, and welcome, Minister. In evidence, we heard from Professor Hazeldine, who said, in Scotland, we do not have a clear industrial roadmap for the circularity of our heat or carbon. How will the Scottish Government ensure that negative emission technologies will remove nearly 25% of gross emissions from Scotland's 2032 total without a plan?
It's certainly it's an important point, and I greatly respect Professor Hazeldine, his expertise, well recognised internationally, not just recognised domestically. In terms of his charges there around, and indeed your very legitimate question about how nets will remove, a quarter of gross emissions over that timescale, it is important to ask. We are confident that it's technically possible to deliver nets by the late 2020s, including trial and demonstration projects by 2029 and large-scale installations by 2030. There's not to say it won't be challenging, not least because talking about new technologies in some cases and needing to get significant projects through the planning system, and obviously potentially in the face of opposition. We can't anticipate how local communities will see this. But delivering all of this would include the need to identify and bring forward concrete proposals for nets projects quickly and ensure there's funding available for the feasibility and early stage design, so we can get things moving quickly and not see that become a barrier. Perhaps in advance of the market being ready for it, we need to try and kind of stimulate things early. I know Mr. Golden has a lot of experience in this sort of area, regulatory area, but much of the responsibility is obviously reserved to UK Government, so we're working with UK Government in that respect, and and areas where they still hold responsibility for policies relating to the structure of the electricity market, for example, including the support mechanisms like Contract for Difference, which could be broadened to pick up some of these new technologies. And I know that's something that I'm sure Mr. Barting, as Secretary of State, and Mr. Trevelyan, as Energy Minister, will probably be looking at. And carbon capture and utilisation and storage, we obviously have just referred to. We believe that is essential to reach net zero emissions, and it's key to industrial decarbonisation. So while not a negative emission technology, a negative carbon technology on its own, CCS obviously enables nets such as bioenergy or BECCS or direct air capture, which I referred to earlier, DACS. And we continue to support obviously Acorn CCS project at St Fergus, which we obviously hope will be operational by 2024 and be able to store over 5 million tonnes per annum CO2 storage by 2030. So, you know, there are obviously UK funds as well. The UK government has a £1 billion carbon capture utilisation storage infrastructure fund. We'll obviously support the sector in Scotland to try and access that, and we'll obviously encourage UK ministers to look kindly on projects in Scotland that could really help move things on. And as I mentioned earlier, the Emerging Energy Technologies Fund, our £180 million fund, and also support the development of hydrogen and CCS, which may help too. So I appreciate the point that Professor Hazel is making, and you're obviously voicing that concern as well. But we will obviously seek to try and pull much of this together through the update to the energy strategy later this year.
Thank you, Minister. Just as on a slightly separate but related topic, what are your thoughts on the conflict between burning wood for biomass and the use of wood by the wood panel sector? UK-wide, that sector contributes almost 850 million in GVA and supports 7,500 jobs. And 3 of the 6 sites are in Scotland, yet 25% of the UK annual basket of wood is used as a fuel rather than in manufacturing.
Well, it's a really important point you raised, Mr. Golden, because we've had to do quite a bit of work at this. We've had the Forest Products Association, the wood panel kind of, the fibreboards kind of panel industry raising issues with us as well, and Confor obviously as an industry body looking at supply of timber and wood fibre. Raising concerns with us about this competition between bioenergy and construction sector. And so Mr. Ewing, Mr. Ewing, who's the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, who covers the interests of the timber sector, has engaged with me, and we've put out consultations also on other products such as the use of draft from distillers, which is obviously also a potential area of concern in terms of bioenergy. If too much of that was used for bioenergy, it may disadvantage farmers who need it for livestock feed, for example. So it's a highly nutritious, protein-rich product for use in supplementing agricultural feed. So we're trying to get these tensions right. We obviously have been looking at developing a bioenergy action plan. It will probably take the form of a position statement in due course, which will set out some of these concerns. But you are right, if we're coming to develop BECCS, for example, we need to be really sure of the feedstock that will be required for that, and to ensure that we are planning for that. Otherwise, we'll end up with supply shortages and impacting on more than one sector, which would clearly be in nobody's interest. And we're also looking at other alternatives in terms of bioenergy, such as the use of animal byproducts, such as slurry and other products for anaerobic digestion. That's another way in which you can generate energy from otherwise what would have been a waste product. So it's certainly an area we can provide more detail to the committee convener if that would be helpful, just on the evidence we've taken so far around this challenge and what steps we're taking in developing our bioenergy policy. And that will obviously feed into the updated energy strategy later in the year.
Thank you, Minister. Just very quick follow-up. Just the bioenergy action plan, is that something you would plan on making a statement on before the end of this session?
I don't think that is planned, Mr. Golden, just because of the constraints on parliamentary time, but certainly something we can look to engage with the committee. It would be helpful to set out where we're at with that. It's not yet finalised, but obviously I'm conscious of the strong interest in it. We can certainly give our position to the committee as to where we're at with the policy and rough timing about when that would be finalised, presumably after the election, and the incoming government would then be able to sort of take on that work at that point. But we'll get detail to you and the committee.
Deputy
Thank you, Minister.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to you, Paul. Just a few final questions from me. You were just talking a moment ago about the whole industrial decarbonisation issue that we face. How could you just say a few words about how we balance out the sort of risks and rewards between governments, between industry and consumers, so that everybody can get a slice of the action, if you like? Could you just give us a few words about that, please?
Of course, and it's a hugely significant point, because obviously a just transition will be essential if we're, to be a core part of any green recovery of the industry sector. So it obviously means supporting industry to transition in a way that's fair and no one is left behind. Obviously avoiding carbon leakage, which can cost people their jobs, which obviously is an important part of just transition. We need to try and support businesses to migrate across to lower carbon opportunities without losing the jobs in the process, and positioning industry to capture hopefully growth opportunities from net zero as well. So it could be a positive. So we obviously want to deliver the transition in partnership between government and industry, as well as with individual places, to get a sort of place-based approach, and with regions and indeed local communities at the micro level. And such a partnership approach is being demonstrated with initiatives such as the Grangemouth Future Industry Board, the Scottish Industrial Decarbonisation Partnership, the North East CCUS or Nexus, which are all set out in the Climate Change Plan update as examples. And we believe that without putting in place substantial economic incentives via the appropriate policies, significant investment in deep decarbonisation cannot be expected. So all industries in scope combined can expect to incur additional costs of around 0.8 to 1 billion per year by 2045. We're also trying to help support businesses to avoid those costs going forward, or at least to manage them earlier. And I suppose that you look at what's happened in Scotland so far, what we've managed to do, if you recall, the likes of Lord Stern's report originally trying to talk about keeping the cost of decarbonisation to 1 to 2% of GDP by acting early. That is what we have tried to do as a parliament. It's what we've tried to do as a society, and with some degree of success so far. We need to try and get that early adoption and over a longer period of time to bring things in, rather than have a real project crash, and we'll save everything to the last minute. So most of our policies, where we are criticised for going too slow, it's to allow the supply chain to respond and to secure the jobs locally in Scotland, rather than seeing us having to import product from elsewhere, to allow a planned pipeline of projects to develop so that the industry can respond and build up to them. And where we've had problems in areas like offshore wind, it's because the market has been very lumpy. It's not allowed the industry to respond. And so that's an example of where a just transition hasn't worked so well, and we need to do better. And that's what the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council is trying to do for the offshore wind sector now. Just transition principles are really important, Mr. Coffey, and I'm glad you raised them, because we have to get the balance between the kind of cost the consumer pays in terms of, say, electricity prices, gas prices, and get that balance right. But also think about the cost to consumers in terms of their jobs, protecting their jobs, and it's no comfort to them if we manage to keep the price of electricity down, but they've lost their job. So we do have to try and get the balance right across all the different groups: consumers, industry, obviously, and households and businesses.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the back of that answer, Paul, could I make my usual shameless plug for Ayrshire? I mean, how do we make sure that various communities and parts of Scotland also benefit from the development of these new industries? I mean, I would hate to think that because we haven't been part of a traditional industry in the past, that we still won't be part of these new industries of the future. So how does the government try to make sure that the benefits of the development of the new industries will be shared reasonably fairly across Scotland?
Well, it's a huge issue. We've obviously got some major investment programmes underway. Very publicly, I suppose people know, we've committed 1.6 billion to domestic energy efficiency and heating in the next Parliament. That's a significant sum, but as I said earlier on, that's a subset of the total spend in the economy that will be required just for heating energy efficiency, which might be in the region of up to about 17 billion over the next decade to achieve our decarbonisation goals. So that's owner-occupiers, it's registered social landlords, it's government, it's public sector bodies, everybody investing in energy efficiency heating. And we'll obviously, we can't predict what funding will be after 2025, but we've committed 1.6 billion of our Scottish Government funds so far. So that's an example that we know that investment should create local jobs. One of the best sectors for creating local jobs is construction, and particularly in this respect, construction in the form of retrofitting properties, putting renewable heating systems in. That can generate local jobs, and building up the supply chain in doing that is very, very important. Areas like hydrogen, for example, there's no reason why, and I do feel that we certainly as a society let down communities like Ayrshire and Lanarkshire, Lothians, other areas where there was coaling communities that were pretty much abandoned by all forms of government during the decoaling period. And we've obviously seen Longannet as our last coal-powered station disappear from the Scottish landscape literally in the last couple of weeks. So we need to do better as we transition other sectors into a net zero future. But there are some really exciting opportunities, like I say. And if we are going to have wind farms developed in Scotland, then let's ensure that developers are working in local communities on shared revenue opportunities, make sure the local community benefits from that development. Let's ensure that communities where they have aspirations for a local energy project of their own are supported to do that. Obviously some challenges with the loss of feed-in tariffs regime, which was very important to those kind of projects. And we are trying to work through Local Energy Scotland and other routes to find alternative ways to lower the cost for projects to make them viable perhaps through low-cost finance for the capital expenditure rather than the revenue support, to try and offset the loss of revenue support mechanisms. But this is all really important. Our local energy policy statement set out some of the issues there. But these are all aspects of trying to help communities win in the green recovery and ensure that they get the jobs that will come from that. And as I say, in my previous answer, to protect the jobs that are already there, allowing existing businesses to survive and thrive in a new low-carbon world.
Thank you for that. Just very, very briefly, if I can, Convener and Minister, you mentioned the Strategic Innovation Challenge Fund. I think you said 26 million in a response, I think, to Colin Beattie. It's amongst a number of funds that are there. Could you just say a few words about that? I have a company in my constituency who find it difficult to bring their idea forward to the government. It's about intellectual property, Paul, and the retention of that or the loss of that when they bring forward their innovation and ideas and proposals. Can you see any way to make that process a little bit smoother, and might that fund help new companies who are emerging to also try and get a slice of the action?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I've met one or two companies myself who've tried to engage with, for example, our work in wave energy, for example, that have been deterred because they haven't been able to be guaranteed that their intellectual property would be protected. So there obviously are sometimes, not intentionally, but there can be sometimes barriers like that deter companies from engaging with the kind of financial support we've made available to develop green technology. We can obviously look at that. That's an issue that maybe I can pick up with Ms Hislop and Mr Ewing as the respective cabinet secretaries which cover both the all three enterprise networks, to see what we can do there around any R&D funding and other routes to support technology development and SMEs. And so it's really important, obviously, if there's a bright potential product for a company in somewhere like East Ayrshire or North Ayrshire, where we know we need to try and stimulate the local economic growth in the area, then it's important we try and do everything we can to achieve that within whatever state aid or subsidy control mechanisms that now prevail. But certainly the issue around the Strategic Innovation Challenge Fund, that wasn't the fund I was referring to earlier, which is a new fund aimed at manufacturing. But that was a proposal which didn't proceed because we developed a number of other funds which aim to achieve the same objective. So we are, if you like, achieving the policy objectives, but through different funding, such as the Emerging Energy Technologies Fund, the manufacturing fund as well. So as I say, hopefully we can set out detail of the funds that we're referring to, if that would be helpful to you. but we believe we're achieving that without the use of the SICF, because that idea was dropped.
Okay, many thanks for that. Thanks, Convener.
All right, thank you very much to the Minister and his team, who have not actually been called upon, as it happens on this occasion, to speak, but thank you for being there. And I will now suspend the meeting to allow a changeover to the next panel, and we'll meet again in public just after 10:45. So thank you very much. Well, welcome back to this meeting of the Economy Committee. We now come to item 3 on the agenda, which relates to subordinate legislation, namely the Companies Act 2006, Scottish public sector companies to be audited by the Auditor General for Scotland, Order 2021. And I welcome Fiona Hislop, the Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, and her official Gary Jones, who is the Finance Business Partner. And I would invite the Cabinet Secretary to make her opening statement on the instrument. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you and good morning, Committee. I thank the Committee for taking the time to consider the draft legislation. Ferguson Marine is a new public body. It was established in December 2019 when the business was brought into public ownership. My team have engaged closely with Audit Scotland on the appropriate approach to the audit of the business accounts and the role of the Auditor General in that. In February last year, my team agreed with Audit Scotland that the audit of Ferguson Marine's accounts for the year ending the 31st of March 2020 would be undertaken by an external auditor appointed by Ferguson Marine's Board of Directors rather than by the Auditor General. This is because there was insufficient time between the business entering public ownership, the 2nd of December 2019, and its financial year end to allow the audit order process to complete with the necessary consultations. Both I and the Auditor General are keen that Ferguson Marine fall within the scope of his audit oversight, and this has always been the intention. The proposed legislation, if approved, will enable the accounts of Ferguson Marine to be audited by an auditor appointed by the Auditor General for Scotland. This will provide the Auditor General with greater oversight over the finances of the shipyard and will increase the transparency of progress being made in the business. The proposed legislation will also bring Ferguson Marine in line with other Scottish public bodies under the scope of the Auditor General for Scotland, and this legislation has been developed in consultation with Audit Scotland, and the Auditor General has welcomed the ability to appoint an external auditor to the organisation. So I hope that the Committee will support the move to align Ferguson Marine with other Scottish public bodies and allow the Auditor General for Scotland to appoint its external auditor.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Are there any questions on this from members? There do not appear to be any questions on this from members, so we move to item 4 on the agenda, which is the formal debate on the motion to approve the affirmative instrument we have just considered. And I would invite the Cabinet Secretary to formally move the motion.
I formally move the motion.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Does any member wish to speak in this formal part of the debate? As no member wishes to speak, I will put the question that motion S5M23994 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed, so that is agreed. In light of the timing, I will invite the committee to agree that I and the clerk will produce a short factual report of that committee decision and arrange to have it published. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. So I now turn to item 5 on the agenda, where we are considering budget for 2021 to 2022 and the impact of COVID-19 on businesses, workers and the economy. We have with us the Cabinet Secretary, Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture. We were meant to have Richard Rawson. I'm sorry, I think I have to suspend briefly to allow for a changeover of witnesses, because I think Gary Jones is being replaced, so to speak, by someone else, although the Cabinet Secretary is remaining with us. So perhaps we'll just suspend briefly to do that. Thank you. Welcome back to the meeting, and we now turn to item 5 on the agenda, which relates to the 2021 to 22 budget and also the impact of COVID-19 on businesses, workers and the economy. So I welcome Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture. Also with her are Richard Rollison, the Deputy Director of the Directorate for Economic Development, Mary McCallan, who's the Director for Economic Development, and David Wilson, Interim Director for Fair Work, Employability and Skills. And I will first of all invite the Cabinet Secretary to give a brief opening statement before we come to questions from members of the committee. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. This is my first budget as Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, and my absolute priority is supporting economic recovery while we continue to do all that we can to suppress COVID-19 and ensuring the safety of Scotland's workforce. So we have an opportunity to invest for the future and design an economic recovery that works for all of Scotland's people. And crucially, our plans are to rebuild our economy with well-being, sustainability and fair work at its heart. And this budget allows us to make further progress by investing in policies that support our national mission to create new, green and good jobs to make sure that no one is left behind as a result of this economic crisis. So the total economic economy and fair work and culture portfolio budget allocation for 21-22 increases by 10.5%, that's 98.5 million, to £1.036 billion. That includes a £170.3 million increase in resource funding, plus £27.2 million increase in capital. I also want to advise Cabinet, I'd like to advise the committee that Cabinet are currently agreeing the budget allocation following £1.1 billion of COVID-19 support confirmed by the UK Treasury yesterday, and this will provide an additional £21.5 million financial transaction funding to Scottish Enterprise. So that will bring their financial transaction spending power to the same levels as this financial year at £48.5 million. So this welcome development means that Scottish Enterprise will see a significant overall rise of £42.2 million to its budget allocation, including £12 million for resource, £30.2 million for capital, including £8.4 million for Green Jobs Fund, and FTs now maintained at the 2021 levels rather than the 21.5 reduction as reflected in the budget that you've been considering. This additional investment is in the face of ongoing economic challenges arising from COVID-19 and the UK's exit from the EU, and the budget underpins our plans to renew and rebalance our economy. It will support the work being taken forward by Scottish Enterprise to help companies withstand the challenges, protect and create jobs, and help deliver an economic recovery that is fair, that is sustainable, that is green. And central to our plans for economic recovery is our commitment to doing everything that we can to protect existing jobs, to support workers to upskill and reskill, and to create good quality jobs for the future. And we must protect and create opportunities for our young people, many of whom are being hit the hardest by the economic impacts of the pandemic. So the budget includes an additional £125 million for the Young Persons Guarantee, Employability and Skills provision, which will support delivery of continued investment in employability training and skills opportunities, for example, like the National Transition Training Fund and the Flexible Workforce Development Fund. The additional £125 million in 21-22 will be allocated as follows: £70 million to deliver the Young Persons Guarantee and achieve our ambition of supporting every young person. £35 million will help strengthen skills interventions, including the National Transition Training Fund, the Flexible Workforce Fund and the Talent Attraction Service. And £20 million will be going into the No One Left Behind programme, and that demonstrates our commitment to a person-centred and place-based employability support. For 21-22, the budget also includes funding of £27 million for our devolved employment service, Fair Start Scotland. This funding underpins a 2-year extension of the service, which we expect to support up to 29,000 people. And that funding represents a £5.8 million increase on 2020-21. And that's based on the forecast of expenditure assessed by the Scottish Fiscal Commission. For 21-22, the government's commitment to employability and skills is reflected in the education and skills portfolio allocations as well. The grant and aid for skills development Scotland has been increased by £6 million to £230 million, and an additional funding of £21 million has been made available to the Funding Council to support foundation apprenticeships in the college sector and graduate apprenticeships in higher education. We're also supporting local authorities' environmental health officers and trading standards officers with extra resources of £2.9 million over this financial year and next, and reflecting the increased ask of them, and to allow them to step up their inspection and enforcement where necessary. The funding builds on our already significant investments into the Young Person's Guarantee, employability and skills, and recognises the increasing challenges we are likely to see in the labour market this year, while also contributing to our national mission for new and green good jobs alongside our Fair Work commitments. So over the next Parliament, we will deliver a new £100 million Green Jobs Fund, and this will invest £50 million through our enterprise agencies to help businesses which provide sustainable or low carbon products and services to develop, to grow and to create jobs. A further £50 million will support businesses and supply chains to take advantage of public and private investment in low carbon infrastructure and the transition to the low carbon economy, and that should boost green employment. In 2021-22, we will allocate an initial £14 million from the Greens Jobs Fund. So we'll also continue our investment in the Scottish National Investment Bank. Now, that's the single biggest economic development in the history of the Scottish Parliament and the UK's first development bank. We've committed to a bank capitalisation of £2 billion and will provide £200 million of fresh capital for investment in 21-22. The bank is mission-led with a primary mission to help provide the investment needed to put businesses at the forefront of driving forward our net zero ambitions. Its investments will provide finance and catalyse private investment to achieve a step change in economic growth by powering innovation and accelerating the move to a net zero emission, high-tech, connected, globally competitive and inclusive economy. We will provide £36.7 million for the continued development and build of the National Manufacturing Institute Scotland. Through our inward investment plan and our Trading Nation, a plan for growing Scotland's exports, we aim to attract more foreign investment and help our exporters be more successful. So we're working to support more strategic investments up to £20 million per annum to grow exports from 20% of GDP to 25% by 2029. And our capital investment plan is also planned for launch in March, and that will set out a strategy based on Scotland's future strengths and opportunities with a set of actions to improve our performance in attracting internationally mobile private capital. And following the outcome of the capital spending review, we will invest £26 million of capital funding over 5 years to a low carbon manufacturing challenge fund, which will support innovation in low carbon technology, processes and infrastructure. We'll also provide £25 million of investment over 5 years to support the Clyde Mission low carbon heating project. And the Scottish budget commits to extending the current NDR relief available to properties in the retail, hospitality, aviation and leisure sectors for at least the first 3 months of the financial year. So the latest GDP statistics published on the 12th of February show that the UK economy grew by 1.2% in December, but shrank by 9.9% in 2020 as a whole. That's more than twice as much as the previous largest annual fall on record. So we recognise how difficult the challenge ahead is. However, we feel this budget and the portfolio priorities will help lead our economic recovery and to rebuild a stronger, more resilient and sustainable economy for Scotland. And I look forward to engaging with the committee on the budget.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You mentioned GDP. The pace of recovery has, of course, slowed markedly, including in Scotland, since the summer months due to the COVID situation restrictions. And the FSC do not expect GDP to return to pre-pandemic levels till something like the beginning of 2024. So what is realistic then, or in terms of planning or approach, if we think of the Advisory Group on Economic Recovery report, that was published in June 2020, but had obviously been in preparation prior to the pandemic. Is that report still relevant? What research or work has been done to try and adjust to this rapidly changing situation in light of falling GDP and the need for recovery as soon as we're able to get there? What's been the adjustments made?
So, I mean, as you say, the Scottish Fiscal Commission are recommending or expecting their forecasts that the GDP in Scotland will grow by 1.8% in 21, but won't return to levels till obviously later, and 7.5% in 2022. Your reference to the advisory group report, I set that up by moving very swiftly, recognising the importance of planning for economic recovery. Much of what is in that report absolutely still stands. They did actually take, I think, quite a considered and long view of how we will have to come through what would have been a considerable disruption. We obviously responded to that with our own economic response. We added into the activity individual sectoral by sector industry-led recovery plans. So we've seen that in tourism, we've seen that in construction, and we're currently on the consultation on the manufacturing recovery work as well. So in terms of the response, it's not just Scotland, it's not just the United Kingdom. Globally, obviously, the response to this will not be something that can be dealt with immediately and quickly. I think what will need to be an immediate and quick response will be on unemployment. We had anticipated prior to the extension of furlough, if you can recall, that there would be a cliff edge perhaps last October and then December, and that's now been extended because the furlough, which is protecting so many jobs and is very welcome indeed, has been extended to the end of April. So we're anticipating the immediate responses will particularly be in the employability area, and that is why I've stressed the issues around the Young Person's Guarantee and that increase in the employability aspects. In terms of recovery, there's obviously a lot of companies and organisations will be in survival mode to get through this period, but we need, as the advisory group and economic recovery set out, a green recovery and a focus on digital activity. And so therefore you've seen the Logan report, the tech scalers investment that's part of that support that's in the budget, but also recognising the importance to grow low carbon jobs and green jobs, and therefore the growth agenda is critically important. And that is why I've focused on the work of Scottish Enterprise and what they can do to grow the companies that will develop the jobs of the future. So we can't be completely confident as to where things will go. Nobody can forecast, but we can plant those seeds, and we expect the entrepreneurial interest that companies will establish. We've set out, for example, a range of areas within the export plan I talked about, Trading Nation, as well as our inward investment plan as well. So there is no one, and there won't be one single measure that will lead to economic recovery. We have to make sure that we're functioning on a range of areas, and I hope in my opening remarks and within the budget you can see that we want to build that recovery looking at a variety of different measures, whether it's sustainability for businesses, as we can see immediately, or indeed, and importantly, growing the sectors that we think will be important in the future.
Yeah, so I suppose your point is that in light of changing circumstances, perhaps the report and some of its recommendations remain relevant, but have had to be adjusted in light of where we're at, as it were. As far as the progress being made on the report's recommendations, can you update the committee on where we're at in terms of actually delivering on the recommendations or adjusting to that?
So I can tell the committee that I've commissioned work in plotting the progress in delivery against the individual recommendations and also against the Scottish Government's response to that. I can assure the committee that all the recommendations have been taken forward. I think in terms of the energy of that, a lot of that work had been taking place since the summer through October and delivery now, and I'm more than happy to share that with the committee when it's finalised. But I can give you absolute reassurance that that is what I want to see happen. I'm pleased to see that the progress is being made, and as I said, I think the report itself was quite far-sighted in looking to the longer term and not just having some of the immediate issues that needed to be addressed.
Would it be possible to give the committee some sort of interim written update? I mean, I appreciate you appreciate where we're at in terms of the election cycle, yeah. And if you've commissioned research, it may not be available. So any sort of a written update of some sort would be, I think, useful and helpful to the committee to see. And I appreciate you're not in a position to simply give that to us off the cuff, as it were, here. Are you happy to do that?
I'm more than happy to work with the committee, bearing in mind what state it might be in, but certainly even some kind of interim indication to you. But I'm pleased with the progress.
Thank you very much. Now, Alex Rowley.
Thank you, Convener. Can I begin by asking a question of the Cabinet Secretary? I'm always curious at budget time about how joined up budgets are and how these budgets actually are joined up to focus on achieving outcomes across government departments. Specifically, what I want to focus on is something that's not mentioned in your budget, but is housing. And in near enough every community across Scotland, one of the greatest needs is housing. The lack of housing, we have record housing waiting lists with councils and other housing associations. And there is no plan for a 15-year to 20-year housing building programme, and that's, I think, what we need if we're going to tackle Scotland's housing crisis. But there are clear links to your brief, Cabinet Secretary, because if we had that sort of 10 to 20-year programme in place, you're talking about thousands upon thousands of apprenticeships and tens of thousands of jobs. When I asked the Fergus Ewan about the rural economy the other day in housing, he actually linked it specifically to, if you're going to attract workers to come here and migrate here, you need to have the housing for them. So it just seems to me there's a whole joined up or not joined up approach to this that's there. Do you see housing as an economic development opportunity, and do you think that a 15 to 20-year housing build programme will create tens of thousands of sustainable jobs?
So I do think that a 20-year programme is important. It's why we are developing our Housing 2040 programme. I'm not the Housing Minister, as you reflected, and neither am the Infrastructure Secretary. But what I can tell you is I've had 2 meetings even in recent weeks about the 2040 housing programme, which is exactly the proposal that Alex Rowley is referring to. He might not be aware about the 2040 housing project, so I'm quite happy to ask my officials or in the relevant department to share it with him. Why is that important? Because obviously, as he knows, housing and construction is vital to recovery. It's why right at the beginning of the pandemic, supported the construction sector, prioritised it in terms of their route to reopening. It was very, very important in how they did that. They were the first to establish an industry, union and public sector recovery task force. They've published their recovery report and the aspects within that. And in terms of also the other area, particularly private investment capital is important, as he will know, in the market stimulation as well. So that's part of the discussions I've had, not just with Aileen Campbell, who is the Cabinet Secretary responsible for housing, but also with the Scottish National Investment Bank. They'll take a keen interest in there as well. Housing has not been helped by the collapse of financial transactions that was in the budget. There was a 60% reduction in financial transactions. You'll be aware that housing in particular relied on that. I'm hopeful with the recent discussions today in relation to funding. There might be additional funding for housing, but again, I'll leave that to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance to set out those aspects. But the other, and I'm conscious I've said a lot here, but the final aspect, and it does reflect what Fergus Ewan will have said, We're also going to be, and I've been in charge of producing our population task force. And if we want not just people who are moving into our country from elsewhere, but also if we want to make sure we're repopulating rural and island communities, then housing is a vital part of that as well. So in terms of that activity, I think you're absolutely right. Housing is everybody's business. And in terms of whether it's employability, whether it's repopulation, a whole variety of different areas. But I'm more than happy to try and send the information about the Housing 2040 plan to you when it's in a state to do so, or at least update you as to the progress of it. But it's Aileen Campbell has been pursuing this very rigorously in recent months.
Okay, thank you. And this week I certainly wrote to the Chancellor ahead of his budget and pointed out to him exactly what you said there about the furlough, and raised the point with him that the Scottish Fiscal Commission is forecasting unemployment will reach 7.6% in the second quarter. So specifically, do you believe that the Chancellor should look at the extension of furlough beyond April? And should he be looking at sector by sector, because some sectors will not be able to return by that time? So firstly, are you doing anything about that? Have you tried to put pressure on the Chancellor? And secondly, what can the Scottish Government do, given that some sectors will not be able to recover by April? And if furlough goes, we could see a massive fall in unemployment and businesses collapsing as a result. Thank you.
So I think Alex Riley is absolutely correct, and certainly the furlough welcome will certainly is protecting a lot of jobs, and the underlying unemployment rate I think would be much, much higher if furlough wasn't there. But I think it's also in this context really worth emphasising most companies want to be opening and want to be having their employees active and conducting work. So furlough is not somehow some kind of subsidy that is desirable. Furlough is something that's essential both for the economy and individuals. And in terms of looking at the cost benefit analysis to the UK Treasury, it will be worth their financial outlay to continue furlough. I think a broader scheme is what other countries have done, and including right till the end of this year, recognising it as it's a tool in the fiscal armour to stop the big bills that will be facing DWP, not just for paying out unemployment benefit in its variety of guises, but the cost to then stimulate economic growth, to then re-employ people or get people re-employed. So in terms of a continuity and a smooth continuity to a period of economic growth, the furlough is not just a really useful tool in survivability of businesses and keeping people on their books. It's also an important bridge to what comes next, and that's where if he does want to limit in some shape or form the furlough provision, looking at those sectors that are most seriously impacted and for longer, and for those sectors that even if they can reopen at some point, and this is going to be a long, slow haul. I mean, you'll hear the First Minister talking about that this afternoon. But in reopening, they might not be able to get to the levels of profitability that they previously had. So therefore, there has to be that bridge. So furlough as a bridge, as well as the lifeline that's been in the last period, is the context in which I think the Chancellor should be looking at extending furlough. And yes, we have pressed the UK government on this, and even as recently as last week in a Quad meeting with the Business Minister as well, to impress on him, and obviously colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland are also supportive of that.
Thank you, Convener.
Sorry, Convener, I can't hear Alex Rowley if he's asking a question.
I can't either, Cabinet Secretary. Alex Rowley, did you ask a further question? I'm wondering if
Convener, that was me finished. I thank the Cabinet Secretary. Thank you.
Well, that would explain the absence of a question. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to just touch on economic development and enterprise budget. Now, I'd be very happy if you update us on any aspect of this maybe that is out of date. But I noticed that it was proposed originally that the innovation and industries budget would be decreased by 39% from 30 million to around 18 million. Obviously, that budget's to cultivate a culture of innovation, entrepreneurship, global ambition among Scotland's innovators. And given the future ambitions around economic recovery, how can this decrease be explained?
Well, it can be explained by the 60% collapse in financial transactions that the Scottish Government received, and so therefore that had an impact on the areas that have previously been supported by financial transactions. However, it doesn't mean that we won't be carrying out innovation. Well, sorry, it doesn't mean we won't be carrying out innovation and technology areas of investment support, because they're, as the member said, absolutely essential to growth and development. The good news is, as I've announced today, that the cut of financial transactions to Scottish Enterprise budget has now been replaced as recently as this morning. So that will be part of the announcement that will be taking place this afternoon by Kate Forbes. So that's extremely helpful. And what I can also say is the innovation and research budget had been particularly ring-fenced previously in order to try and drive business enterprise R&D that we know had been facing some challenges, and the intention had been to double that level of investment more broadly, obviously looking at external investment as well. So the target in 2017 had been to double the BRD investment. In terms of the targets and where we are just now, that figure has been revised up, and actually in terms of our investment, there's been significant investment in that area. So I've not got an issue in terms of, are we stimulating enough investment? Is there going to be resources available to continue that investment? The answer is yes. But reflecting back on the committee, and when you looked at your pre-budget scrutiny, one of the things you said about the Scottish Enterprise budget, that it perhaps lacked flexibility to manoeuvre. And I think reflecting the convener's remarks at the beginning about to what extent do we need to tack and adjust depending on what's required over the next period in terms of economic development, providing flexibility for a Scottish enterprise to position that investment is really going to be important. But I can absolutely assure you, if you look at our National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland, our aerospace low carbon investment, what we're doing in the space sector, also what we're doing with the Strategic Board by working with the Scottish Funding Council with our universities, we anticipate that drive and that good experience that we have of stimulating business enterprise research and development in particular can continue. It will just be more flexible in terms of, instead of being ring fence, it will be able to be identified and used in the most appropriate way. But the good news is that reduction has been removed. So, convener, to recap, in terms of Scottish Enterprise, they've got a 12 million increase in resource. They've got a 30 million increase in capital. Much of that capital could also be used and is being used on innovation investment as raised by Colin Beattie. And then thirdly, although we've seen a reduction in financial transactions as of today, and that's why I thought it appropriate I got permission from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance to discuss this with you, because it is the most, I suppose, the area of the budget that has moved the most. We've managed to restore that. So actually our enterprise company, Scottish Enterprise, is in a stronger position to help meet the challenges that were laid out by the convener at the outset.
Can I then take reassurance from what you say that the support for early stage businesses is restored and hopefully enhanced?
Yes, indeed. And, as part of our this year's £1.2 billion economic recovery activity, I specifically provided funding in the summer of 2020 for early stage growth companies, because that was an area we thought that in the market would have been a restriction in levels and amounts of investment. So I think if you judge the track record of the last year, you will be, I hope, give reassurance that the budget for this year not only has the resources to do that, but we've also got the economic approach that recognises that supporting early stage growth companies is part of that growing the jobs in the areas that we know the economy can certainly benefit from, and to provide jobs for the future. So that's the balance of supporting and protecting jobs of today, but growing the jobs of the future. And early stage growth innovation companies are absolutely part of Scotland's future.
Now, a few minutes ago, Cabinet Secretary, you picked up on the committee's recommendations for more flexibility to be built into Scottish Enterprises budget. The committee actually recommended flexibility and contingency. How exactly have you responded to that recommendation?
So in terms of contingency, there's different aspects to that. I'm quite clear that in terms of business support, it's been important to provide contingency to ensure that whatever the experience of the virus has been, we can adapt accordingly. So, if you look at the new variant, far more transmissible, real issues around that caused, so much disruption, in end of December, January. One of the things that the Finance Secretary has done is made sure we've got enough funding to help support people at the highest level. So who would have known back in November, December, when she was putting together the strategic framework business support, that sitting in February, we would have all of Scotland in those businesses that are required by law to close, all sitting at level 4, all requiring the highest level of business support. So that would not have necessarily been forecast in November. So that's a contingency. Where you were talking about in terms of Scottish Enterprise, the issue there is to make sure that they can support businesses that have enough FT capital to support equity and loans for companies that may have difficulties faced either by COVID-19 pressures or indeed by EU exit. And my worry now, and where I expect the support to be required going forward, is those companies that COVID, they've managed to use, and they've been using their working capital, they've managed to use loans, facilities. They were viable before COVID, but they're restricted now, and for many, demand has collapsed as well. But in areas we would expect at some point demand to come back up. What we're finding with Brexit, that could be the final straw for that company if they're exporting, for example, and they're facing difficulties. So looking at cash flow issues, looking at opportunities for equity and loan issues, that's one of the recommendations from the Advisory Group on Economic Reform, the Benny Higgins report that was referred to by the convener. That was one of the areas that we need to look at. So contingency for the enterprise companies to help in that space is really needed, which is why if you look at the capital support that we've provided, that's as much a part of economic recovery. So contingency can operate in different ways. It can be operating in relation to the basic business closures. It can be operating in relation to businesses that are facing real struggle, and we expect the support from the UK government in the areas that are impacted by the EU exit. And Michael Gove's made clear that they would help and support businesses. The seafood support, however limited it is part of that as well. So looking at different sectors, I don't think it will just be the seafood sector that will be facing problems because of the EU exit issues, but a lot of the issues there are unwinding and they're becoming more apparent just now. The issue is to what extent exporting is part of the business plan operation of many companies. And I think we'll all know that for many years we've been calling on SMEs in particular to innovate and export. We know those companies that export are more likely to innovate, and we want them to continue to do that. So do we know and can anticipate the levels of cash flow issues going forward? It's hard to predict. Scottish Enterprise currently are revisiting the 1,400 most, dare I say, Brexit vulnerable companies that have been previously identified to find out what the current situation is. But obviously they stand ready to support as and when required. But we can't just hold that funding and not then invest in the types of early stage growth or innovation companies or the low carbon sectors that were previously mentioned by the member. So it's a balancing act, as you might appreciate.
Thank you. Just to move on to the Scottish National Investment Bank. Obviously, previously with the decline in financial transactions, there was a concern about the future funding of SNIB. Now, obviously, there's been a restoration of financial transactions. Does that mean that this source of capital will now fund SNIB as was anticipated?
There is 200 million in the budget for Scottish National Investment Bank financial transactions. Even before the 60% reductions in financial transactions, we were clear that the commitment to the Scottish National Investment Bank and their funding levels would need and must be honoured as part of that patient long-term, but also recovery funding that they'll be able to help supply. So, they were always a priority, remain a priority, and their funding is secure this year. Obviously, we need to anticipate what will happen in the future. Financial transactions clearly are now at the stage where we're starting to get revenue income in different areas, and that needs to be factored in. So going back to Scottish Enterprise, they also then will benefit from the returns that they're getting from the financial transactions as well. But it's an area we'll keep very close eye on in terms of financial transactions and indeed potential for more capital investment in the future. But we set out our plans. We've launched the Scottish National Investment Bank. They've had the first investments and have been capitalised to the level that's going to be required. And certainly that £2 billion over that 10-year period is a very strong commitment. £200 million in the budget that is in front of you just now.
There's no anticipation there'll be a need to source capital from other portfolio areas?
The capital investment plan obviously was set out before, at the same time as roughly as the budget, and you'll see the capital investment plan, the public capital investment plan over a period of time. We are not anticipating what you're suggesting at this stage. Obviously, we have to look at the year-on-year developments of capital and FTs as we go forward, and because of the direction, particularly in reductions of FTs by the UK government, not just for the Scottish government, but for other devolved administrations and within the UK government itself, we will keep very close eye on that. But I can reassure the member and the committee that our faith and our confidence and our funding for the Scottish National Investment Bank is strong and secure.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Questions now from the Deputy Convener, Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Fiona. I wanted to talk to you about the support for young people, and you mentioned the £125 million earlier on, and you broke it down to £70 million for Young Persons Guarantee, £35 million for skills and training, and £20 million for a No One Left Behind fund. You'll probably be aware about the work that the committee has done in recent months, focusing in on young people, and particularly the COVID impact on employment opportunities for young people. I wanted to ask if any of the schemes that we have in place reach out to our university graduates who are coming out of university looking for their first opportunity to get into the world of work, and how we might assist employers to help them to get into that first job that they're also desperately keen to get. I know a number of members of the committee were very concerned about this, so any thoughts that you have on that would be greatly welcome. Thank you.
So the Young Persons Guarantee, again a recommendation from the Advisory Group on Economic Reform, is for 16 to 24-year-olds, and that specifically covers that age group that you're referring to. There's obviously a lot of focus on young people who may be leaving school, etc. But the and the progress there, even in challenging times, remember we've still been closed. We've had 18,000 new opportunities identified over the last year, as well as 10,000 in terms of the transition training. But the real demand will be the second and third quarter of this year. We're anticipating, unless, as going back to my answer to Alec Riley, some of the other issues on furlough can also be identified. But for young people that are recent graduates, that is one of the target areas that we will work on with obviously the colleges and universities, but also with employers that are looking to take on people in that area. We recognise, and I'll go back to the Funding Council, additional funding they and indeed STS have, that young people are going to be a priority. That's why there's additional funding for graduate apprenticeships, foundation apprenticeships. But even that experience of getting some kind of internship or preferably paid employment is going to be really important. And that's why we're very keen also to work with the UK government to make sure that our provision, which is hopefully to provide some kind of 2-year-round package with young people, can use the Kickstart as some kind of part of that package, and it also provides between that and the subsidies that may be available through local authorities, that can help companies take on somebody. There are a number of businesses that want to do their bit to take on people in their own community that know they have a responsibility, and also it can help them grow, and particularly in areas of digital marketing, different areas where we know that there's been a step change in different areas. So the developing young workforce, those groups are really important to provide that regional leadership. They are going to be led by it's employer led, and they're going to be fundamental in helping with local authorities to identify subsidy schemes for businesses to take on the sort of people you're identifying. There's also a portal which I would ask all a website portal. I would ask all members, all MSP, to promote in the local areas. It's a single portal that young people can come in, employers, and to make it user friendly for them to help identify what's available to them in terms of those opportunities.
That's really helpful. If you could give more details of that, I'd be really obliged for that, Cabinet Secretary. I just wanted to ask you, what are employers saying to government? The feeling that we got from the young people giving evidence to us is that the recruitment process basically has sort of dried up, particularly the graduates side. It seems to have dried up during COVID, so they're looking for that little bit of additional help, perhaps, to enable the employers to bring graduates in for a period of time to get us through this awful time that we're in at the moment. Is that something that you're aware of, about the recruitment process perhaps tightening and drying up a bit?
Well, recruitment process generally is in a challenging state, and I know, for example, from the school side, one of the areas that's going to be really important is the employment in each school of a developing workforce coordinator. Now, this was piloted in 5 previously, proved very successful, and that was a really good link between the school and employers, precisely for that reason. It's more challenging, I think, for universities and colleges, but I'll speak to Sandra Begbie, who's kindly agreed to help lead on this programme, Young Persons Guarantee, to identify how we can link colleges and universities, who I'm anticipating, again, it's not my area, it's in the education side, but I'll check with Richard Lockhead what's happening on that side. They keep very close contact with recent graduates, etc. Can they then use that forum to help make the connections with employers that are seeking employment? I think it's very difficult to take on somebody when you're remotely. I mean, I've had to do that myself within my apartment. I've got a member of staff who have actually not physically met. So this is the reality of challenges. So we've got to be realistic. But I do think there's and the companies, and we'll be able to announce some of the new companies who are graduate recruiters that want to be part of the Young Persons Guarantee. We'll be announcing more of them shortly. But if you look at the areas that we want to develop in, particularly in the digital side and particularly in green energy, these are areas where there's going to be a strong need for new staff, and also in financial services, which again they'll be they've been successful in this period, very busy, as you can imagine. So there are opportunities there, but we need that collective national mission for jobs. The national mission for jobs isn't just the Scottish Government; it's for everybody. And I know employers know that as part of that economic return, there's this generation that we need to focus on. But I will get more information, particularly about how we can interact between recent graduates and the Young Persons Guarantee, and share it with yourself and the committee when I get the opportunity.
Good. My last query for you, Cabinet Secretary, you've mentioned the digital side several times, and one of the messages we're also picking up from young people is, because of the COVID situation, we're seeing much more online and distributed work going on, of course. It was always possible to do that, but the COVID kind of prompted that to gather pace, I would say. Is there any way we are thinking about trying to encourage employers to distribute their employment opportunities much more widely within our communities, so that particularly young people in the more rural communities in Scotland can have a realistic prospect of working in the community that they live in, rather than us all flooding into the cities in Scotland, as we've done for many, many years? So there's a real opportunity here to use digital technology to encourage employers to offer employment opportunities in a much more distributed way.
So I know the member has valiantly for many years advocated the digital economy and the opportunities there, but the reality that everybody's facing means that people have rethought how they operate and what they do. Clearly, the opportunities now to work in a virtual way in any place is quite evident. There are many companies, and I speak to them on a regular basis, are rethinking what they will do even when physical distancing isn't required at some point in the future. And so therefore that mixed type of hybrid operation is something that is being seriously considered by everybody. I would say that what he's suggesting was a subject of discussion I had with the leadership of COSLA, and I spoke to council leaders just last week when we were addressing the ministerial work I've been leading on the population and our population task force that I hope to publish in the next few weeks. And that again is an opportunity to think differently. That it used to be, and people may, I think, I suppose with some pain, remember the issues around Scottish national heritage when there was very early on in the Parliament the proposals to lock, stock and barrel move the whole department or the whole agency. That was in the very early days of the Parliament and the disruption. You wouldn't necessarily need that now. What you could have are people either living and working with people in more rural, remote areas, or importantly, as Willie Coffey has said, actually enabling people to live and work in the communities they grew up in. And when we look at I think it was 8 last year, and it was a third year before of local authorities in Scotland losing population, then that's a good way to help embed that. And it goes back to the point I said with Art Riley and housing as well. A joined up thinking about how we can actually regenerate and have a place-based approach to economic recovery. That's something that I think we need to look at and encourage that and find ways of doing that. So co-location, even before the pandemic, I was discussing with major organisations, not least obviously banks having closed branches up and down the country. Could we use vacant properties to have sponsored workspaces that people could have as hot desking, etc., in remote rural areas? This is all I've had the discussions, those discussions also with those that are involved in the IT sector itself and in terms of the delivery, because we all know we're all human as well. So actually living and working on your own is quite a lonely place to be, even though it's great to see colleagues on screen. But actually having physical places in remote localities, people can go, still work for the company, still work at home, but not travel, but spend money in that local community, is one of the ways that we can tackle what is probably one of the most serious long-term economic challenges facing Scotland, is the direction and the loss in percentage terms of working age population. So as you can probably tell from my answer, I'm quite enthusiastic about this idea.
Thank you so much for that. That's really appreciated. Back to you, convener.
Maurice Golden.
Convener. Cabinet Secretary, the extra £1.1 billion in funding announced yesterday takes total UK government cash delivered to the Scottish Government to almost £10 billion. Will some of this funding go towards 100% rates relief for businesses in the leisure, retail, hospitality, newspaper and aviation industries?
So in terms of the funding, you'll know that prior to the announcement yesterday, just about a third of the investment had already been spent on business support, and as I replied in a previous answer, 1.2 billion of economic recovery. In terms of the announcement just yesterday, I think this is symptomatic of the speed at which we have to respond and not anticipate what's coming in terms of our share of consequentials. I'm tempted to say, convener, had you not invited me onto this session this morning, I would have been able to take into full discussion at Cabinet of the decision making around that, and I would be able to tell you what the answer is to Maurice Golden's question. But clearly we know that rates relief is really important, and that's why, without any additional funding from the UK Government that would be anticipated, we had already committed to that first 3 months support for different sectors. Aviation, you'll recall, is only being supported in the Scottish Government, but I think we anticipate and that's why I've also called on the UK Government to work on a task force, along with the Welsh in particular, on aviation as a sector, because it's facing real challenges. Scotland can be, low carbon manufacturing in that innovation space, but clearly the collapse in demand in the aviation sector is having major impacts. So therefore, any support we can give them is to be welcomed by them. But in terms of therefore of the deployment of the funding, as you might appreciate, I'm the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy. I'm not the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, and I want to give Kate Forbes her place, and she will make her announcement at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The most recent statistics for the Strategic Framework Business Fund show that 24% of applications were rejected and 11% were awaiting processing. Can you explain or provide further insight on the reasons behind the rejections and any issues causing delays?
So obviously we're keeping a very close eye and examination on the issues facing local authorities. Those local authorities that had previously been in level 4, for example, in December, obviously can move much more quickly in distribution. Then can I just commend the work of the councils? We are expecting a lot from them in terms of very targeted as well as very general funding provision. My understanding is in terms of those that are rejected, it's because they're not eligible. Clearly, it's quite clear in the guidance you have to be, either legally required to close or the hours in which you can work had to be restricted. And clearly at level 3, that latter one was important. It's why we've now doubled the discretionary funds for local authorities from £60 million, that's now £120 million. Because a lot of companies that I think were applying for the strategic framework were companies where their demand had collapsed, but they weren't legally required to close. And that's exactly where the discretionary funds can step in. Supply chains, for example, are in that category. On the 11% figure, some of it may be those councils where, have just started doing level 4, but also not all businesses provide the information that's required in the time that's required. And also we know from January, some didn't apply till very near the end of January as opposed to the beginning of the month. So I think they're doing very well. We know that £270 million was distributed in January, January and slightly before that as well. And as we've committed to do, Kate Forbes is committed to keep Parliament informed as the progress of that. But clearly the decision to extend level 4 funding for February has been very welcome indeed, and that's been really important.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you, Convener.
Now Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. And much of what I was going to ask has actually been covered, but there was one question that I was keen to try and understand. There are 350,000 SMEs in Scotland, and many of them have concerns about defaulting on loans, retaining employees, sustainable supply chains, and postponing their growth projects because of the uncertainty. And I was just wondering how, as we look forward and start to, thanks to the vaccination programme, put COVID behind us, and we're aiming to see a bit of growth in the economy in the next few years, how do we cover supporting these companies through this transition period? And how do we gradually phase out the support, whether it's non-domestic rates relief, or how do we start to phase out the support as companies as the economy starts to grow? Has there been any thoughts given to that?
I'm afraid the concept of putting COVID behind us is one that I think is really challenging. I think we're going to be living with the health consequences for some time, and indeed the economic consequences for some time. But I think the member's right to think about, okay, how do we ease out a period of loans and debt, etc., and get into a period of investment and growth? And that's a real challenge now. Some of that, and it's not all about the public sector. Clearly, backed by the extensive borrowing and other financial mechanisms that the UK government has had, they were able to establish a comprehensive system of loans and CBILS, etc. The recent announcement of pay as you grow by the UK government in terms of repayment of this debt, I think is welcome. It's a good prospect, because this idea that you can't suddenly have a cliff edge where you've got your tax burden, you've got your repayment for your loans, etc., all coming in at the same time. So forbearance, I think, is the watchword, for the foreseeable period, and that should be for government and indeed for the banks themselves. It's in the interest of banks for businesses to survive and to grow and to be their customers of the future. And so that area has been one that I have had increasing interest in. And indeed, we'll be shortly publishing a piece of work that I'd asked Benny Higgins to do, coming out of the Economic Advisory Group's report in relation to financing the recovery, but financing the recovery also from the private sector. And there are real asks and challenges of banks in terms of how they behave. Now, you've also had a situation in Scotland where there's probably been many, perhaps family businesses that had not wanted to get into debt previously, had perhaps had an adverse experience 10 years ago with the financial crash. But also there are companies that have taken on, and because of the availability of low-cost loans, and not necessarily use them completely. And we need to encourage them to perhaps consider investment for growth, as opposed to necessarily just repayment. So it works two ways. And I've spoken to UK Finance recently. It's an area that whether it's the letter has just gone, I've just signed off a letter to John Glenn of the UK Treasury to make sure that we've got a strong and robust agenda saying, look, again, we've got a national mission for jobs, but we need to have, this has got to be a mission for everybody in terms of helping those companies that you're talking about so they don't have a cliff edge. And how do you have that kind of smoother aspect, but they don't have to focus so much on their debt that they're not thinking about the investment for growth. And that's quite a paradigm shift, and particularly for a lot of the SMEs that we're talking about in Scotland. But that idea of equity and loans and how we can use them effectively and how we can work with business and the business banking sector in particular, and they've got a role and responsibility here as well. That's going to be an area of my particular focus going forward. I can't share too much of it, but when I'm in the position of sharing that report, the financing the recovery, I'll share that with the member and indeed committee convener with yourself, with the wider committee.
Okay, thanks very much.
Right, Graham Simpson.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. It's good to see you. I just want to mop up on some of the areas that we've already covered. Willie Coffey was asking about graduates. Now, am I right in thinking that there is no specific help for graduates, people who graduated last year? We're talking about, of course, we'll have a new cohort graduating this year. I think from what I heard, you want to do stuff, but it hasn't happened yet. So am I right in thinking that? If I'm right in thinking that, when help does appear, do you think that the universities that they graduated from should be letting them know about it? Should they be keeping in touch with graduates who have been, just sent out there with no prospect of getting jobs? And if I could also touch on a couple of other areas that have been mentioned. Aviation, is there going to be extra help for the aviation sector? You're well aware of the problems they're encountering at the moment. And also the newspaper sector, I think Maurice Golden mentioned this. Will there be a business rate extension, as Parliament voted for last week?
Oh, so on a number of areas, clearly the latter point that the member mentions, that's an issue for the budget discussions, and I'm sure that the Conservative Party are engaging actively in the formal negotiation process with the Cabinet Secretary on those issues. In relation to aviation, I agree with you, it's a big challenge. It's not just an issue for Scotland either. I know in terms of what we can do in Scotland, Jamie Hepburn's been leading a group looking at recovery in terms of aviation in the aerospace sector more generally, but it also requires a UK input and coordination. We have an official sits on their work on the task force. We think there should be more ministerial and collective approach. The Welsh and the Northern Irish are extremely keen that the UK government establishes more work on the aerospace and aviation sector more generally, so that it can be more coordinated in its response. In terms of investment, I've talked about particular focus, the national manufacturing Institute in Scotland, the work particularly in the partnership with Rolls-Royce, for example, in terms of their research funding and their activity within that area. So there is an opportunity in low carbon manufacturing, particularly for Scotland to take a lead in this area. So in terms of does the budget reflect our ambitions for aerospace and aviation, yes, but I think he's probably referring more to survivability and coping, and that's obviously an issue that's more widespread across the UK. In terms of graduates, I don't want to give the impression there isn't any proposal. There is support for graduates, and that continues. Indeed, the portal I've just referred to for the Young Person's Guarantee allows any young person to be able to access that and to link up with opportunities that exist. Do I think there needs to be more done for graduates? I suspect yes. As you might be aware, this is not necessarily my area of responsibility, but I do know that universities already keep a very strong track of employability experiences of young people, but this past year in particular has been a real challenge. So I'm not going to pretend that it's been it's been easy, and I don't anticipate that for this year's graduates that there's been any extensive opportunities. And of course, even those areas where you can get temporary work, it's been, people have obviously had to fall into whatever they can. A lot of it might be remote working, a lot of it might be call centre. People are having to try and get income from whatever source of employment they can at this stage. But for many young people, the areas that traditionally would have gone for, even if they were trying to get into their long-term career path, those, whether it's retail, hospitality or clothes, that's caused an issue as well. But I know it's an area that we don't want to lose out on. One of the I suppose the benefits in Scotland, and one of our economic strength, is our level of graduate capability. We've got one of the highest levels in terms of higher education of any part of Europe in terms of our numbers of graduates. And if we want to maximise productivity by using their skills, we need to ensure that we can do that. But I'm more than happy to try and, I think obviously there's an interest in the committee in graduate unemployment or graduate opportunities. And with my colleagues, again, I'll join up with Rich Lockhead in particular, and to make sure that we can give you a proper briefing of what the opportunities are and what's happened over the last year. And importantly, that point about, just as the developing and workforce coordinators in schools are the link to employers, how we can work with universities and colleges to make sure there's something similar. And I know that there will be people who do this already. I'm afraid I don't have that information at my fingertips, and we'll share it with the committee when I can.
Well, thank you. But my strong impression is that the universities don't actually, or aren't keeping in touch with people who graduated last year. So you've got many young people who are out there, with the little prospect of a job in the immediate future. Now that's nobody's fault, but I think there does need to be ongoing contact. That's just a personal view. Now, you mentioned a portal. What is that portal? Can you remember the name of it?
Well, it'll be Young Person's Guarantee. I'll get somebody hopefully will type it up on the screen. And I know members have been getting lots of letters from lots of different cabinet secretaries, not least the health secretary, but the vaccine programme. I did write and send out all the links to members previously when we launched back in November. So I'm more than happy to send that to you as well, and to refresh, because I think, as you said, that we need to all collectively spread the word of what's available and the access points that young people have.
Okay. That's it from me, convener.
Thank you. And now Richard Lyle, last but not least.
Always, convener. Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, can we clear up a wee myth that's you've been asked? Do you agree that any money, including the 1.1 billion we got from the UK government, is not a gift? It actually is our cash back, and it's not a handout as some people portray.
Well, consequentials are our share. I think the kind of cashback consequentials is an interesting trademark name and reference for them that Richard can obviously take credit for. But this is our share of funding. Every single government across the world is having to put enormous amount of funding into tackling the COVID challenges. One of the recommendations in the advisory group on economic reform was to look at the fiscal framework to identify how the Scottish Government could have the levers that we would need, including increased borrowing, to ensure that we could provide the funding levels that are required. But obviously a state has got far more extensive powers than a devolved administration has. but this funding is our share of that. But you're looking at £2 trillion worth of debt issues. It's massive, as it is for many other countries, and that's why a lot of our discussion today is not just about what we do over the next year in the budget we're scrutinising, but that transition going forward and how we recover, and having the ideas, the ingenuity and the ambition to recover will be part of every government's focus over the next period. But yes, can I say this 1.1 billion is funding that's due to Scotland from Scotland as part of the regular settlement. And the challenges, and no doubt you'll hear that from Ms Forbes, is however welcome additional funding is, trying to plan when you've basically got a couple of days' notice is always a real challenge, however welcome obviously that funding is. But as he said, I think he's done the myth busting, and our cashback consequentials is a phrase I expect to hear for some time to come.
Okay, thanks for that. The budget of 2021-22 states that the Scottish Government will extend fair work criteria to as many funding streams, business support grants, public contracts as possible. Can you provide more detail on this, and will the fair work criteria become a clear condition of any COVID-19 support?
So conditionality is part of becoming that fair work, well-being economy, and how we do that is really important. So we've already, as part of the funding streams that we've been providing, have been asking companies to demonstrate what their fair work credentials are. I think many companies themselves, having talked to them, are also recognising that the well-being of their staff and being able to have good, well-paid, motivated staff, especially if they're working from home just now, is really, really important, and how difficult that has been. So I think there's an opportunity now for the Fair Work agenda to really, do you realise I'm talking to the Fair Work Convention this week? I think it needs to be a hallmark of how Scotland conducts its business. And certainly in terms of the funding and programmes going forward, that was already a commitment from Scottish Enterprise for this year. But you can imagine the volume of cases we've got, the volume of you're talking about 300,000 businesses applying for funding support. There has to have been simplicity in a lot of the programmes and how we've had the processing for that. But increasingly, I think fair work conditionality has to be part of the society and the economy we want to be, because it's about bringing both those things together. And actually, you can't compete on low wage, low skilled activity. It's got to be about high wage, high value businesses. And that's what the business, if you look at the business focus and economic growth that's in the budget, that's the direction we want to travel in.
I haven't personally.
Sorry, carry on. Richard.
Sorry, I haven't personally thanked you for the help you gave to show people. So thank you for that. I'll take this opportunity to publicly thank you. In light of this pandemic, does the government intend to review any of the statistical measures for performance, or indeed develop any new measures in the national indicator in regard to the National Performance Framework?
So the National Performance Framework is increasingly important, not least because it was established with the SDGs, etc. And I think in terms of a well-being economy, it's going to be increasingly important to measure how successful we've been. The Strategic Board, the Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board, looked at some of the initial work on the Performance Framework analysis at their January board meeting, and I understand they're going to further look at that in March. Again, convener, this is the sort of work that we can share with you, as much as the achievement against the recommendations from the Economic Recovery Report, also in relation to the National Performance Framework. I'm happy to share where we are with that. But I think if there's one of my officials might want to give further detail on that, and while we're identifying who that is, one of my officials has kindly set out to me what the website portal is on the Young Person's Guarantee, and as we're on the record, it's probably worthwhile, I think, advertising that. www.myworldofwork.co.uk/youngpersonsguarantee. So hopefully that means that you're all going to be publicising that at the end of this meeting. But in relation to that important question about monitoring the National Performance Framework and the changes in the analytics, which of the officials are best to come in? Richard Rollison, I think, is going to come in. If you can, Richard, please share where we are with that.
Yeah, so thanks, Ms Hislop. So I think the National Performance Framework and the outcomes and the indicators they're long-term outcomes and long-term indicators, long-term measurements that I guess you look beyond the pandemic and into recovery. I think that there's other work happening though across all of government and especially in the economy space to monitor the particular impacts of the pandemic and how we might at this point supplement some of the NPF indicators, I guess, just to take account of the circumstances which we are currently in, and as Ms. Hislop has said, are in for a bit of a longer haul as well. So that analytical work is taking place as well.
I think David Wilson wants to come in regards to the Young Persons Guarantee, convener.
Yes, specifically. Thank you. Specifically on the Young Persons Guarantee, one of the commitments that we made as part of the launch of the guarantee last November was to develop a performance and measurement framework, and that will very much be framed and developed within the context of the National Performance Framework. And there's one of the specific indicators in the National Performance Framework is around participation in employment, education and training amongst young people, and that will be the principal measure, and we Skills Development Scotland publish an annual assessment of participation, and that will be the principal indicator. But what we're also seeking to do is develop a wider range of both qualitative and quantitative indicators to help us monitor both progress of the Young Persons Guarantee, but also to evaluate its sort of longer term impact. And while participation is probably the principal element of it, it is a guarantee after all, or seeking to ensure there's places for young people in education, employment or training. We also want to assess how it's contributing to the wider issues facing young people in the labour market, whether it's the impact on women in employment, those with disabilities, and the wider equalities concept as well. So we're developing that performance framework, and we intend to publish it a bit later in the spring.
Thank you very much. That's me, convener.
All right. I think there's no further questions, so thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and to your team for coming in this morning. And I will now suspend the meeting. We'll move into private session shortly. Thank you.